Meninaida the Piliado Achilleus, sing goddess, the rage of Achilles. The very first line of the Iliad sets the scene for its climax. Patroclus, paramour of the king of the Myrmidons, is dead, slain at the hands of Hector, the prince of Troy. In his grief, Achilles' wrath knows no bounds. Consumed with vengeance and bloodlust, no soldier, prince, or even river spirit is a match for the immortal son of Thetis. As the Trojan army flees back behind their gates, one warrior remains outside, the eldest prince of Troy. As Achilles chases Hector around the walls of his considers rescuing him from the Myrmidons' wrath. Alas, Hector's fate has been weighed upon the golden scale, and his life is forfeit. Knowing the gods have abandoned him, the Prince of Troy turns to face his foe and prepares to make his final stand and enduring siege in all of Western literature. Yet equal to its impact is the everlasting question, did it really happen? Was there ever a war between the Greeks and the city of Troy? Was there even a city of Troy? In this video, we will compare fact to legend and assembly and Total War Saga Troy, a brand new strategy game set in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, which dives into the legendary 10-year Trojan War between the kingdoms of Troy and Mycenaean Greece. This new game from the award-winning series allows you to play as one of 8 characters, including legendary heroes Achilles and Hector, and fight alongside mythic units including centaurs, minotaurs, and giants. This game blends grand strategy, turn-based empire management, and spectacular real-time battles. A huge campaign map with 200+ settlements will give you an opportunity to experience the late Bronze Age in all of its glory. Total War Saga Troy will be available for free if you claim it from the Epic Games Store during the first 24 hours after the launch today. For more information, check out the link. The real history of the Trojan War is dubious at best. The Iliad itself is inseparable from the magic of the Olympian gods, who constantly provide divine intervention for both sides. In Book 12, Zeus conjures a massive thunderstorm that wreaks havoc through the Greek army, allowing the Trojans to push them all the way back to their ships to force back the Trojan advance. When this magic is stripped away, is there enough left to prove the existence of a real city of Troy, or a great war fought outside its walls? Before we talk about the potential existence of epic cycle, which the Iliad belongs to, is often associated with classical antiquity. This is the most famous era of ancient Greece, and features the golden ages of Athens and Sparta, the iconic hoplite, and the Persian Wars. However, in truth, the stories of Homer's Iliad would have been as distant a memory to a classical Athena as the fables of King Arthur are to modern Britons. Indeed, to understand the historical context behind the Iliad, we must go back to the of the mysterious Mycenaeans. Rising to prominence around 1600 BC, these ancient forebears to the classical Greeks would have been familiar yet alien to the 5th century Athenian playment. They worshipped an early form of the Olympian pantheon and wrote their records in a script known as Linear B, which was wholly distinct from the ancient Greek alphabet. Their power was centered in aristocratic palace complexes across Crete located in Argos, where the semi-mythical Agamemnon was said to have ruled. The Mycenaeans were a thalassocracy, with greater ships than nearly all of their contemporaries. They roamed the seas, growing rich by trade with the Hittites, the Assyrians, and Egypt. The Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age world was tethered by trade connections often established by the ambitious Mycenaean sea lords. However, the Mycenaeans were as much warriors as they were bird-beaked prows atop Mycenaean galleys struck fear in of the Eastern Mediterranean, save Egypt, would all topple in a crash of apocalyptic proportions known as the What brought about this destruction of civilization remains a mystery. It is most likely linked to the brutal invasion of the vaguely defined Sea Peoples, among them possibly some Mycenaean pirates. Whatever their origin, the great and in the fallout, ancient Greece entered a 4-century-long period known as its Dark Ages. Trade links were severed, towns shrunk, society became more rural, and artwork became more simplistic. Most importantly, Lee was abandoned. However, even as the Greeks of the Dark Ages became centuries removed from the palaces of Mycenae, they never era came to be seen as a more magical age, where gods and spirits walked freely amongst mortals. To the Peloponnesian shepherd, the gods were real as earth and water, and their presence in an ancient tale did not compromise its realism. Without a writing system, these stories were preserved orally from generation to generation. One poet who probably existed at the end of the period was Homer. Modern historians are split on whether Homer was one man or a series of chroniclers building upon each other. So for the sake of linearity, we will choose to depict him as the former. The seminal poet told the story of a vast armada of ships that had once set out across the Aegean Sea to lay siege to the great city of Troy. This story was the memory of an ancient war, so grand in scope that all the gods of Olympus were bound to interfere. By the time Greek civilization re-emerged by playwrights like Euripides and Sophocles, thus far we have explained how they have preceded it. With that said, to answer whether the Trojan War was real, we must jump far ahead in time to the late Victorian age and dive down the rabbit hole of 19th century archaeology. The father of modern archaeology, to others a conman and thief. Schliemann was a massive admirer of Greek antiquities, and at some point in the 1860s decided to dedicate his life to the search for ancient Troy. Fortunately for him, he was friends with Frank Calvert, a British diplomat in the Ottoman Empire, who just so happened to land a mound called Hisarlik, which he claimed to be the site of the great city. Allowed to excavate Hisarlik, the German archaeologist began with fervor in 1870. As his team dug straight, Schliemann was overjoyed to find not one, but 9 ancient cities by Nile. The German asserted that the second deepest, and therefore the second oldest site, Troy too, was the city from the Iliad. He even liberated a collection of bronze and gold artifacts of that layer, and draped them over his problematically young wife, dubbing Priam's treasure, more likely to actually be Homer's Troy. Schliemann died in 1890, leaving behind an ethically questionable legacy, and never having discovered the true city featured in the Iliad. Nevertheless, if there ever was a Troy, then the site of Hisarlik was the most likely Anatolian coastline, doorstep of another bellicose empire, the Hittites. Feuding between the Hittites and Mycenaeans was nothing new at that point, and with the two civilizations' spheres of influence inching closer and closer to one another, possibility. In this climate, Anatolia was beginning to look more and more like a crucial borderland between two warlike expansionist peoples. Troy itself was strategically crucial for both empires. Therefore, if there ever was an attempt by the Mycenaeans, a crucial conflict could well have served as the basis from which the legend of the Iliad was born. Based on the discovery of an inscribed seal at the Hisarlik site by modern archaeologists, the modern consensus is that the Trojans themselves were Luwian, an Anatolian people closely related to the Hittites. While the Olympian gods, other clues to their Luwian Anatolian culture can be found in Homer's epic. The name of King Priam, for example, is likely derived from the Luwian title Pariamua, meaning exceptionally, while his son Paris's name likely originates from Parizit, another attested title among the Luwians of unknown meaning. In the Iliad, Priam practices polygamy, a custom commonly associated with Bronze Age Anatolian kings, while Paris is a renowned marksman, drawing parallels to Anatolian warriors, who, unlike the Greeks, were excellent archers. Furthermore, the young prince's characterization as a vain and effeminate pretty, which they reductively saw as more hedonistic than their own. Perhaps the most compelling parallels we can draw belong to Helen, the face that launched her ships. Noble women of Hittite-related cultures tended to have more freedom and political influence than their Greek contemporaries. Homeric tradition relates that Helen was whisked away from her home in Sparta by the goddess of love Aphrodite and delivered to Paris to be his bride. In truth, if there ever was a real Helen, she may well have been a Mycenaean queen of Spartan origin. However, her elopement with a Trojan prince was certainly costly intervention, but likely the result of an ambitious woman seeking to escape the confines of Greek social norms by fleeing to a land where freedom and power were more possible. Overall, these surviving glimpses of Luwian Hittite culture among the Trojan nobles of the Iliad all point to the fact that Homer was indeed telling a mythos from the distorted perspective of a Greek living 400 years after the conflict. Other kernels of reliable historiography in Homer's writings add further evidence too of the Iliad, Greek army, a list that has a remarkable amount of similarities to the locations of late Mycenaean archaeological sites. Later Homeric tradition relates that when the Greeks returned from Troy, their country fell into chaos and infighting, which corresponds with the fact that our presumed date for the Trojan War takes place right before the Bronze Age collapse. Perhaps the conquest of Troy was a last-ditch effort by the kings of Mycenae to preserve their power and prestige before their civilization crumbled into dust. It is not only Greek sources that shed evidence of a great clash at Troy. Surviving Hittite texts are full of many mentions of the Ahiyawa people in aiding the Asua rebellion, a confederation of Hittite client cities on the west coast of Anatolia, including a certain Willusia that rose up in revolt against their imperial overlords around 1500 BC. Willusia was almost certainly Troy, and its name could be from where the Greek name for the city, Ilios, was derived. Meanwhile, the Ahiyawa were of course always eager to help anyone willing to rebel against their Hittite rivals. The word Ahiyawa itself is probably a rebellion to the Trojan War. It is an unlikely match for a few reasons. Firstly, Hittite records claim that the Greeks and Trojans were allied in this conflict. Secondly, the insurrection was eventually crushed by the Hittite king Tudhaliya II. Finally, this conflict took place 200 years before the Trojan War most likely happened. However, the existence of these battles in the Hittite records shows that the struggle between them and the Mycenaeans for the city of Troy was well underway by the mid-Bronze Age, making it very possible that the Proto-Greeks would try to establish control over the city again in later centuries. We've now accumulated a healthy amount of historical literary evidence that the Trojan War could well have happened. But does the archaeological Bergfeld? Unlike Schliemann, who dug down as far as he could, Bergfeld focused his efforts on the excavation of the comparatively newer layer of Troy 6. Through painstaking labor, he managed to unveil the remains of an elevated citadel that had once boasted high walls and towers of stone, and large houses within it for the rich and powerful. Dated to have been inhabited from 1700 to 1250 BC, Troy 6 fit well into the timeline of Homer's war. However, evidence of its eventual destruction pointed not to an invasion of Mycenaean Greeks, but rather a natural disaster, earthquake. This revelation shook the scholarly war, but instead a metaphor. Poseidon was the Olympian god of earthquakes, and the horse was his sacred beast. Could it be that the iconic wooden horse that destroyed Troy was not a physical object, but Mycenaean chroniclers interpreting Troy's natural persist until the 1930s, when an American archaeologist named Carl Blecken took charge at the Hassalic site. His work centered around the site of Troy 7 and revealed something remarkable. Firstly, Troy 7 was not a new city at all, the same city as Troy 6, rebuilt upon the same foundations after the earthquake. Secondly, its citadel, houses that had once belonged to individual wealthy families, were now subdivided, as if made to house an influx. The pithoi that had once stored grain, wine, and olive oil were buried to make them last longer. All signs pointed to the fact that arrowheads, potentially make. Legend discovery barely scratched the surface. While they had focused their excavations around Troy's elevated citadel and main palace, Kaufmann's particular and an underground water system that had been used by the Trojans scene of desperation. Evidence of fired homes, skeletons of the dead remained unburied, and piles of slingstones lay on the streets for the city's defenders invading their home. It was almost certainly war that brought down the city of Troy sometime in the early 12th century BC. So did that legendary duel between history and archaeological tells us almost certainly ever sail across the Aegean and do battle upon its mighty walls? That we may never know for sure. But as archaeologists continue to explore the remains of the once great ancient city, it becomes evident that there is some truth to Homer's legend. Continue exploring these semi-mythical stories, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and press the bell button. We will make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next. In the previous fronts by the resilient Finnish forces, their initial invasion was very badly prepared and executed, and as a result, thousands of soldiers paid with their lives. Meanwhile, at the Karelian Isthmus, the Mannerheim Line remained unbreakable, a bastion for Finland's hope. Now that the Soviets have reorganized their forces and have amassed over 30 divisions on the Karelian Isthmus, a decisive operation is on the horizon. It's now or never for the Soviet Union in our 5th video on the Winter War. Shout out to the Ridge Wallet for sponsoring this video. Members of our team have been using Ridge Wallets for more than a year now. Modern, sleek and industrial design. For cash, it comes in 30 different colors and styles, including our favorites, carbon fiber and burnt titanium. For us, switch for it, Ridge has 40,000 5-star reviews. Each wallet comes with a lifetime warranty, and the Ridge team is so confident that you'll like it, that they'll let you try it for 45 days. If you don't like it, with free worldwide shipping and returns by going to ridge.com/kingsandgenerals and using code KINGSANDGENERALS. The Soviet High Command was highly disillusioned by Merezkov's performance and decided to replace him with Timoshenko, sending him as such. The 7th Army was reorganized into the Northwestern Front under Timoshenko himself, with Chern's 8th, Troikov's 9th, and Frolov's 14th Armies directly reporting to Marshal Voroshilov's High Command. Timoshenko was ordered to breach the Mannerheim Line by Merezkov was then reassigned to lead the new 7th Army. Furthermore, 9 new divisions were assigned into the newly assembled 13th Army under Grendel, placed on the eastern side of the front, and the other 7 divisions were designated as General Reserve for the operation. With so many Merezkov forming 5 army corps and Grendel forming 3. In contrast, the Finns on fortifications were in a bad state, as throughout December and January, the Soviet artillery had shelled their positions daily. And the Finnish forces were not only exhausted from resisting the Soviet onslaught, but also the commander of the Army of the Isthmus, General Osterman, had grouped his troops into 2 formations: the Western 2nd Army Corps around Summa under General Orquist, and the Eastern 3rd Army Corps in the Taipale sector, led by General Heinrichs. Behind them, the Finns had the poorly manned interim line, with only a few emplacements and facilities for the inadequately fortified rear line, which ran from Viipuri to Asari, and from there to Pekisalmi. Although the Finns were numbered, with only 8 divisions against the overwhelming 30 divisions, the defenders were prepared to fight to the last. On February 1st, Timoshenko launched his offensive. When Mereskov's forces approached the Mannerheim line, it took a while for the defenders to realize this was no small attack, but a full army assaulting them in line. Each day they renewed their attacks, focused on acquiring a bunker here or a dugout there. These assaults were very successful, and some positions would remain in permanent Soviet control, further lowering the morale of the Finns. Despite these losses, Palu had withstood the Soviet assaults by February 10th. But this was just the beginning, as one day later, the 19th and 50th Rifle Corps started a joint offensive. The star of this offensive would be the 123rd Rifle Division, with its bunker and all the strong points east of it. By afternoon, their attack had breached the Mannerheim line and reached. Meanwhile, Palu threw back the Soviet attacks at other locations along the front and launched a quick counter-offensive against the 123rd. This counterattack, however, lacked the arms and men needed and thus failed. As Mannerheim became aware of the breakthrough later that night, he immediately ordered the reserve 5th Division to the breach, enforcing the 123rd to capitalize on their success. 2 battalions from the 5th hastened to counterattack the enemy. Pushing back the Soviets, they would be driven back by Soviet tanks. The Soviets started a bombardment of the interim line, and their armored forces rolled straight through the Finnish defenses. Furthermore, just east of the Lada Road, the invaders had created a gap in the defensive line. The following day, the Soviets would continue to widen the breach, while General L. The Soviets could open up a passage in every direction through the isthmus. In the meantime, fierce combat was taking place in the Murky sector as the 19th Rifle Corps slowly progressed through the line of the 1st Division at great cost. By February 13th, they managed to push in several kilometers. That night, Commander Merenskov noted their tremendous success and ordered his corps to exploit this opportunity. At the same time, was to retreat towards the northeast. On the other side, the Soviets would not follow the disengaged Finns, the objective of advancing through the Finnish defenses to the road network on the Kelja-Korpikula-Yaroseva line. On February 8th, the Soviets started their bombardment of the Taipale sector, and the 3rd Corps launched a wide front assault, resulting in the capture of 2 bases at the Tarantula hamlet. 2 Finnish counterattacks had failed to regain it, when a 3rd desperate effort managed to return these positions to their hands. Suffering heavy losses, General Heinrichs had halted Grendal's assault. The Soviets started a strong bombardment and launched a renewed offensive, forced the Soviets to relinquish their newly captured positions. This came at a hefty price in manpower, and the 7th Division's soldiers would have to be reinforced with the French 21st Division. For the next week, the defensive line waved back and forth as the defenders kept recapturing the position the previous day. By February 17th, Heinrich the main Soviet assault, and now the situation was stable for the Finns at Taipei. When Grendal realized this, he ordered the 49th and 150th Rifle Division. On February 14th, Mannerheim arrived to assess the situation. He quickly concluded that despite holding most of the main defenses, the breaches at Lada and Murky forced the 2nd Corps to retreat to the interim line. One day later, the exhausted and battered Finns started their retreat. All Finnish forces had made it to their designated positions at the interim line, and they would be reinforced by the 23rd Division coming from the coast by skiing over the frozen Vipuri Bay to its west bank. Meanwhile, resuming attacks against the new line immediately after their enemies had manned it. On February 22nd, the 23rd finally arrived to relieve the depleted 5th Division, and together they managed to halt the experienced General Tavila would take the corps and General Latikainen would be assigned to command the new First Corps at the left flank of August 2nd. By February 18th, the cohesion of his forces and ordered them to. This offensive was especially successful around Bismarck, where the 150th Division routed a battalion of the 21st and took control of the strongholds on the southern side, while the 49th Corps at Tarantula, forcing the Finns to retreat to the interim line. After the fall of these defensive positions, the Soviets stopped their advance because they feared a Finnish counterattack, allowing Tavala to strengthen positions on the line one day later. The following night, the 7th Division launched a counter-offensive and took back control of the 4th between the. By February 24th, the final retreat into the well-prepared bunkers of the rear line, but the war would end before Tavala reached and defended this last line. In the meantime, the 2nd Division of Colonel Koskimius would soon fall back to the concrete bunkers of the Arafat sector. As Taipale had proven too resilient, Rendell now directed his forces against these positions in the center of the interim line. Reinforced by the 19th Corps, the 23rd Rifle Corps was pushing north with the objective of securing the village of Antreya, while further east, Koskimius resisted the Soviet attacks as best he could, but by February 29th, 2nd Division to retreat to the rear line. But from the village eastwards, Koskimius still controlled his defensive line, so Grendel ordered the 15th Corps to launch an offensive against Arapat's defenders. The commander planned to first destroy the defenses on the south side of the Vorsky and then proceed straight across the Finnish rear to take the village. In turn, Koskimius left the 23rd Regiment to defend Arapat from the western assault of the 4th Rifle Division, while he came forward. On March 1st, the Soviet offensive began, achieving a breakthrough the following day, but this wouldn't push back. As a result, Grendel was replaced due to his repeated failures by Harusanov, who immediately issued new east of Wolselny, positions against them. The Finns south of the Voksy River and at Arapat would have to retreat to the shores. After the capture of Arapat, offensive against the large Vasikasari island. Although Koskimius kept offering fierce resistance, the following day the 50th Division captured the island with great losses. On March 6th, the Finns attempted to regain the island, but Gruzinov's forces repelled them and countered it back to Vasikasari. Following this success, he would be reinforced by the 21st Division, and together they would manage to hold on until the end of the war. Meanwhile, as the continued their assault on the Lada breach, Meretskov task force, consisting of 2 tank brigades and 2 infantry battalions, to take Viipuri on February 28th. But one day earlier, Bergquist's forces had fully retreated to the still incomplete rear line, preventing this new offensive from ever launching. Meretskov, however, had managed to overrun the interim line in its whole length, and he was now preparing his forces for a final assault on the last Finnish defensive line. Right in front of them, Latikainen's 1st Division had taken positions east of the Tali crossroads, with the 23rd Division at its west in the town of Repola. Meretskov planned to do a 2-pronged attack, with the bulk of the 7th Army skirting the city from the east to encircle the Finnish forces, while the 10th and the reservist 28th Rifle Corps had to cross the frozen bay west of Viipuri to secure the road to Helsinki. At this point, the Finnish government was working day and night to resolve the conflict peacefully before the invaders could do tremendous harm to their capital. The rear line had to be held, and Viipuri couldn't fall if they wanted to avoid complete occupation. Towards the end of February, overall command of Viipuri Bay was handed over to the newly formed coastal group, led by the experienced General Valenius. Their situation was very perilous, as the bay was frozen, allowing Soviet tanks to cross it. The 4th Division to retreat from the two large peninsulas to the bay. Valenius then placed his forces on a line of islands extending to the port of Viipuri, directly facing the 3 divisions sent by Merezkov. When the offensive began, the 800-strong defenders at Tripura managed to hold their ground against the invaders, but they couldn't stop them from occupying the smaller islands just north of the line. The following night, however, the Finns at Tripura found their position untenable and had to retreat to Teikasari Island. They would continue to resist there for an entire day before retreating to their final position at the Vilaniemi Peninsula, and drove back the coastal defenders, but forced Valenius to order a retreat from the island line to concentrate at Turkinsari. But despite his best efforts, he would then be replaced because of the disorganized state of his forces. In the meantime, Merezkov launched his eastern offensive against Viipuri on March 1st. The 34th Rifle Corps had the task of directly assaulting the city from the south and from the northeast, where the 5th Division stood in defense, while the 50th Corps advanced in the direction of Repola to eliminate the 23rd Division. On March 2nd, the 3rd Division defending Viipuri itself was assaulted by the 7th and 95th Rifle Divisions, continuing to hold the Soviet attacks on the following days, further preventing the invaders from sweeping into the city. Simultaneously, the heroic 1st Division was holding down the 50th Corps on the Tali crossroads, and the 5th and 23rd Divisions were also resisting the relentless enemy attacks. Back at the bay, the new commander of the coastal group, General Lennart Usch, soon the 86th Motorized Rifle Division, created a bridgehead on the Haran-Aniemi Peninsula. Usch quickly launched a counterattack to regain this position, but by March 5th, the 86th couldn't be dislodged. At the same time, the Finns in Vilaniemi were finally routed to the Kauniainiemi Peninsula. The next day, Usch attempted to recapture Vilaniemi, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Although the Finns had contained this breach, the Soviets had managed to cut off the road to Helsinki, achieving their main goal. With Viipuri isolated from the capital, Finnish Prime Minister Risto Ryti was finally granted permission from Moscow to travel there and start the peace talks. While these negotiations lasted, Heinrich and Mannerheim knew that he needed to hold the invaders at bay. On March 9th, the 70th Rifle Division on Vilaniemi was reinforced by the 173rd Motorized Rifle Division, and one day later, they advanced northward beyond the road. Towards Viipuri, they would finally be stopped by the recently assembled great success on March 9th against the 43rd Rifle Division, and only after being reinforced by the 42nd and 113th Rifle, the 43rd managed to capture the island. The rest of the island would be lost the following day, and the 4th would have to retreat to the Koivuniemi Peninsula in new main offensive against Viipuri on March 11th. But the Finns fought to the last man and resisted both the artillery barrage and the Soviets' incessant attacks. Orquist's position was becoming untenable with each passing day, and so he requested permission to abandon the city. But Mannerheim knew the importance of maintaining Viipuri, and he knew that the war was near its end, so he ordered his men to maintain the city at all costs. On March 12th, Merezkov was preparing for a final assault on the surrounded Viipuri, coming both from south and west, but before the Soviets could exploit their breakthrough on the city, Ryti capitulated to Stalin's terms. A day later, the terms of the Moscow Peace Treaty were announced, and the fighting stopped. Immediately, the majority had started to withdraw to the newly agreed borders, while the depleted 3rd Division remained in Viipuri to lower down the national flag, as the city had been annexed by the Soviet Union. The territorial losses that Finland suffered ended up being more than what the Soviets initially demanded. Although the war ended in defeat, it was remarkable that the Finns had managed to hold on for so long against the Soviet onslaught. The Finnish casualties were around 70,000, 25,000 among them dead. More than 150,000 Red Army soldiers were killed, and 200,000 more were wounded. The Soviets also lost around 400 aircraft and more than 3,000 tanks, which would prove to be important when Hitler attacks the USSR 15 months later. The attack, that's the continuation war. We will continue covering modern wars in the upcoming weeks, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one. Wars often happen, but war often creates the causes for the next one. The conflicts in Europe. In England, the Wars of the Roses stem from the 100 Years' War. Shout out to Conqueror's Blade for sponsoring this video. Conqueror's Blade is a tactical MMORPG strategy hybrid, and it's free to play on PC. You can command an army of 55 diverse units and to create an empire. A new line of units called Sons of the Steppes, inspired by the Mongols, will be added to the game on December 19th, alongside a new battle pass, a new set of challenges, scores of some NPC houses, player titles, and much more. New players who register via our link will receive 10 free gifts, including a gold helmet, 3 unit XP cards, 3 hero XP cards, and 3 Hwacha arrow launchers. And receive these gifts, register a new account via the link in the description. Good luck on the battlefield. The King of England, Edward III. He created duchies for them, making his sons the biggest landowners in the country. On the one hand, this strengthened the crown, but at the same time it formed a new class of nobility, which had claims to the throne and enough power to vie for it. Edward's son and heir, the famous 100 Years' War commander, Edward the Black Prince, passed away in 1376, followed by the king himself a year later. The Black Prince's son was crowned as Richard II. The reign of this monarch was tumultuous. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was followed by the parliamentary crisis of 1386. The lack of an heir and the constant strife with the nobility made him deeply unpopular. Richard's cousin was exiled to France in 1398. In May of 1399, Richard and assumed the throne and died in 1400, while his heir presumptive, another grandson of Edward III, Edmund Mortimer, was bypassed. That created legitimacy problems for the king, and he faced at least 6 significant rebellions. Henry IV succumbed to chronic disease, and the new king was one of the most talented monarchs of England during this era. In 1415, he renewed hostilities with France and won an impressive victory at Agincourt. He conquered more French land than the king before him. The Treaty of Troyes was signed with France in 1420, according to which Henry married French Princess Catherine. Their descendants would inherit the French throne after the death of Charles VI the Mad. Henry V's son, Henry VI, who was less than 1 year old, was crowned as the King of England. The king's uncle, John of Bedford, became the regent and took command in France, while his other uncle, Humphrey of Gloucester, looked after English affairs. Although Bedford was a decent commander, the French soon rallied around Jean of Arc, and Charles VII was crowned as King of France in Rennes. Henry's coronation in Paris was a mere symbol. Governing in 1437, Bedford and the situation in France was untenable. The king was easily swayed by his nobles, and at that point the peace party, led by Edmund of Somerset and William of Suffolk, had more influence on the king than the war party of Gloucester and Richard of York. The sides agreed to peace at Tours in 1444. According to their agreement, Henry was to marry Charles' niece, Margaret of Anjou, and return Maine and Anjou. Among those who protested was Gloucester, and that gave Henry a chance to imprison his uncle in 1447. Gloucester died shortly after, and this weakened the war party even more. Richard, who commanded the English lands in France, was stripped of his office and sent to govern Ireland, which became dukes in this period. However, Suffolk was exiled under popular pressure and then murdered. Hostilities with France were renewed, and Somerset, who was appointed the commander in Normandy, lost all the northern holdings save for Calais by 1450 and returned to England. The prestige of the monarchy and independent, and the dukes often had personal retinues larger than that of the king. At this point, it is essential to show you the family tree of the Plantagenet dynasty, as many grandsons of Edward III controlled these duchies, ushering in the era of what is controversially known as bastard feudalism. This era was characterized by the loyalty of the soldiers being to their lords. The nobles would use that to procure offices, lands, and finances from the king. These lords Richard, who had a strong claim to the throne as a great-grandson of Edward III, used the circumstances to return from exile in 14. Although many came to his banner and demanded Somerset's arrest, the Queen's party was still stronger, and Margaret's pregnancy made her position even more secure. The situation would change in 1453. Affected by the loss of Bordeaux and Aquitaine, the king suffered a mental breakdown and became unresponsive. Scholars still argue about the nature of this illness, but it is clear that Henry VI lost the remainder of his political power. In the north, two noble families, the Nevilles and Percys, used the lack of central power to renew a feud, and as Somerset supported the latter, the Nevilles allied. By 1454, Richard had enough backing to become the royal protector and appoint his supporters to offices, while Somerset was arrested. However, in 1455, the king recovered, and Queen Margaret managed to influence him yet again. Richard's decisions were wrong, and he was exiled. This time, the Duke of York wasn't going to take it, and he raised an army to move to London. The conflict that would later be called the Wars of the Roses because of the heraldic badges used by the Lancasters and the Yorks became inevitable. With his 2,000 men, where an at least Yorkist army was waiting for him. Richard wasn't ready to dethrone Henry, so negotiations started. But as the latter refused to surrender Somerset, the Yorkists attacked. The Lancastrian army, led in battle by the Duke of Buckingham, took up position primarily the gates on Sopwell and Shropshire, while the of Holywell Street, the Market Square, and St. Peter's Square. At 10 a.m., Warwick, Salisbury, and York simultaneously attacked the gates on both Shropshire and Sopwell Lane. Due to its unexpected and swift nature, the attack succeeded at first, with the Yorkists pushing onto the city streets. However, as it became apparent that an attack was taking place, more men rushed to the fists to suffer heavy losses. As the fighting threatened to bog down into a grinding stalemate, the Earl of Warwick disengaged from the battle and rode to the rear, where a rearguard was waiting in reserve. He then led them in a flanking maneuver through the gardens near the Market Square, successfully remaining undetected as he did so. With a blast from his trumpeters, the 25-year-old Warwick charged and smashed the surprised Lancastrian line in two. Fearing of this breach and fearing an attack from their rear, the defenders at the gates now broke their lines and fled. In the square, the Lancastrian remnants attempted to rally, but were prevented from doing so by the devastating short-range fire of Yorkist archers, who continually showered the remaining Lancastrians with missiles. Many Lancastrian commanders, among them Somerset, were killed, while the king was captured. Richard returned into London and was appointed the Protector by Parliament. By that time, Margaret gave birth to Edward and became the leader of the Lancastrian party. It seemed that both sides were shocked by St Albans, as hostilities continued only in the form of the Percy Neville feud between 1456 and 1459. Henry attempted to reconcile the parties on a few occasions, but the suspicions were too strong, and in the fall of 1459, the sides clashed once again. This time, refuge in Calais and Ireland. Richard attempted to claim the throne, but even his staunchest supporters refused. Instead, the so-called Act of Accord was adopted, according to which Henry VI would rule for life, but would be succeeded by Richard of York. The Queen was willing to fight for her son's inheritance, and was gathering her forces in the north. Richard moved towards the Lancastrian troops to prevent their recruitment efforts, but his enemies were already on the way, and their 18,000 blockaded his 5,000 to 10,000 strong force near Sandal Castle and attacked the Lancastrian forces, a move which seems in hindsight to have been incredibly ill. Theories range from simple miscalculation and rashness on Richard's part to Lancastrian trickery. It is said that Sir Andrew Trollope sent pretend deserters to Sandal Castle, proclaiming that their former commander was going to change sides. The Lancastrian forces also apparently showed false colours in order to trick Richard of York into thinking his reinforcements had arrived. Whatever prompted it, Richard chose to ride out from the castle and fight, rather than withstanding the trials of a siege, which would further deplete his provisions. After marching down the modern-day Many Gates Lane towards the Lancastrian forces who were to the north, York was cut off and instantly defeated, and York himself was killed, probably being won. His son, Edward, became the leader of the Yorkists. He defeated a Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross. Meanwhile, a smaller Yorkist force under Warwick was defeated at St Albans by the army commanded by the Queen. Henry VI was recaptured by the Lancastrians. Edward learned about this defeat and moved south, where he united with the remainder of Warwick's troops. It allowed Edward to enter London in March and take the throne, as Edward's sides continued to recruit troops over the next few weeks. Edward left London on the 13th and arrived in Nottingham on the 22nd. But south of the city. King Edward sent Fitzwalter to secure the bridge over the Erne River, the Ferry Bridge. However, Fitzwalter was ambushed by Clifford's cavalry. Many Yorkists were massacred or drowned, but his offer was refused. Edward knew that the main Lancastrian force, led by Somerset, was waiting 2 miles away, ready to crush the Yorkists if they pushed Clifford away and crossed the river. He sent a vanguard which managed to push the Lancastrians back to the end of the bridge. Edward then marched with the main force to Ferrybridge and led his men personally to Suffolk's aid. To stop the Yorkist advance, the Lancastrian ferry across. This raft was captured by the Lancastrians, and the fight continued in the area for some time until the Yorkists managed to cross the river to the north at Castleford and set up camp. At dawn on the 29th of March, was in a snowstorm. At 11 in the morning, they marched northward and encamped on the hill 10 miles south of York with their Edward put his men in formation. Their line moved north and took positions to the north of the Yorkists on 100 feet above them on the meadowland to the south of Towton. Part of their cavalry was the advantage of the high ground. The Yorkist position was shaky, artillery, but the weather conditions did not allow its usage. Somerset didn't want to descend from the high ground and waited for the Yorkists to approach. The battle started with archers exchanging volleys. However, the wind was blowing into the face of the Lancastrian archers, and they were unable to see the enemy properly. Their arrows fell short of the mark, and according to the sources, all they could hear through the whirlwind was the laughter of their counterparts. A hail of counter-volleys accompanied this. The Yorkists were gathering thousands of enemy arrows and were firing them back at them, retreating after each descent from the hill, taking up melee weapons and charging. The Yorkist archers sent a few more volleys and then retreated behind their men-at-arms. As the main Lancaster force charged into the Yorkist army, the hidden flanking force attacked the left flank of Edward's army, did significant damage, and almost routed it. Edward himself led the reserves and stabilized the situation on the left side. Still, the Lancastrians outnumbered their enemies and slowly pushed them back. It was then that the forces sent by Norfolk to assist Edward arrived. It is not clear if Edward attacked the Lancastrians in the flank. Soon, Henry's forces were routed. Sources claim that 20,000 Lancastrians and up to 10,000 Yorkists were killed. Towton, the bloodiest battle fought on English soil. After the decisive victory at Towton in 1461, Edward IV returned to London for his coronation, while Henry VI, alongside his wife Margaret and son Edward, fled to Scotland. The Lancastrian the rise of the Yorks to deal with the last remnants of the resistance. By 1463, Warwick retook all of the castles belonging to the Lancasters. He decided to forgive some of his past enemies, among them Henry Somerset and Ralph Percy. That the Scots supported the Lancasters throughout the first phase of the war. So in 1463, he asked James III to sign a treaty. The Scots agreed and sent their delegates to York in 14. To prevent the agreement from happening, Lancaster, urged by Queen Margaret, rebelled in 1464 under the leadership of Somerset and Percy in Northumberland. Edward sent a force led by Warwick's brother, John Neville, to the north. And in May, he defeated Somerset at Hexham. All Lancastrian leaders, which ended the rebellion for good. The treaty with the Scots was Prince Edward escaped to France to their relative, King Louis XI. In 1465, Henry VI was captured in Lancashire and brought to London, which ushered in a short period of peace in England. During this time, Richard Warwick became even more powerful, assuming many offices and taking lands from the Lancastrians. So in 1464, and the fact that she was from the lower nobility shocked the magnates. On top of that, Edward entered a secret alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, negating Warwick's and started plotting against the king. In 1469, one of his captains started a rebellion in the north. Edward moved to Nottingham in the early days of July. Him decided to wait for reinforcements. His son-in-law, the king's brother, George, called Edgecote Moor. Supported by Warwick's troops, the rebels routed the forces of the king. Edward was captured on his way back to London. Warwick's attempt to rule in the king's name, or even dethrone him, failed, as Edward was still very popular among the nobility and the commoners. Rebellions forced Warwick to release the king, and he ended up with even less influence over governance than before. So Warwick decided to instigate another rebellion in Lincolnshire in March of 1470. This time the king moved swiftly, not allowing the rebels to connect with Warwick. At Loonscote Field, Edward's outnumbered army defeated and routed the rebels. This forced Warwick to flee to France, where Louis reconciled him with Queen Margaret. Kingmaker was going to restore Henry VI, who by now wasn't in possession of his faculties, to the English throne using French support. In September, Warwick landed in Devon. Initially, Edward was to march against him, but Warwick's brother John, who had remained loyal to the king until now, finally rebelled, and Edward had no other choice but to leave England. In October, Warwick entered London and restored Henry to the throne. Meanwhile, Edward found refuge in Flanders, which was under the control of Charles the Brave. Although the help he received from Burgundy was minimal, Edward returned to England in March of 1471. Edward used deceit, stating that he was not vying for the throne and had come back to reclaim the Duchy of York, reinforcements along the way. Even his disloyal brother George rejoined. It seems that Warwick was waiting for aid from allies in England and France, so he avoided battle, and Somerset was forced to leave, either to avoid rebellion or land in Dorset. Edward took control of the city and captured Henry VI yet again. Edward had between 10 and 15,000 men, and was outnumbered by Warwick's army, which had more than 20,000. But he knew that he needed to attack before more reinforcements could join his enemy from the south. Warwick was probably hoping to block the road to the north, as on the 12th of April his troops took a position to the north of London at a place called Barnet. The Yorkist army arrived on the evening of the 13th, and Edward positioned his troops in the dark, planning to take his stand at dawn. It is said that Edward made a mistake in the dark, underestimating the distance between the two armies for shooting Edward's troops, who moved through most of the night to take up positions. He deployed Hastings on the left, and his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, aged 18 at the time, on the right, was to stay with him in the centre. A small reserve was stationed behind the main line. Opposite them, Warwick and his brother John Neville commanded the centre, with Exeter on the left side and Oxford on the right. The Lancastrian knights were dismayed, as that usually showed that they weren't going to retreat and would fight the Commons until the very end. As the morning of April 14th dawned, a mist engulfed the battlefield. The armies failed to line up parallel to each other, with both ending up in a slight oblique formation. Edward's army was overwhelmed. Many of them died during the retreat, while the remainder fled all the way to London, claiming that Edward had already lost the battle. Unfortunately for Warwick, a big part of Oxford's unit remained detached from the battle, as they attempted to loot their fallen enemies, with only part of it. As visibility was still poor, neither side knew about these events. Meanwhile, Gloucester repeated Oxford's manoeuvre, attacking the Lancastrian left and pushing Exeter's troops back. This shifted the lines yet again. Warwick, aware of this, ordered his reserves to support Exeter and restore the formation, while his forces moved against the enemy's centre, and the lines finally joined. It is said that the remainder of Oxford's troops returned to the battle at this point, and in the mist ended up behind the reserves commanded by John Neville, which was sent to support for Edward's banner with the sun on it. The panicked forces of Neville turned towards Oxford's troops and unleashed their bows, killing many of their comrades. As backstabbers to the north, this cry resonated across the Lancastrian line, which ended up in disarray. At this point, the fog started to dissipate, and Edward, seeing his enemies panicked, sent in his reserves to move across the right side and attack the Lancastrians from the flank and rear. Neville were killed, while Exeter was captured. Between 5,000 and 10,000 Lancastrians were dead, while the Yorkists. While this battle was raging, Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, landed in Dorset and were greeted by Somerset. Edward dismissed most of his troops and returned to London, then learned about the arrival of Margaret 2 days later. The Queen knew about the death of Warwick at Barnet, so she decided to move towards Wales with her 6,000-strong army to connect with one of her supporters, Jasper Tudor. A few of her units were sent to the east to deceive Edward, and moved swiftly to the west with his remaining 5,000. By the time Margaret reached Bristol on the 30th of April, Edward was at Cirencester, some 60 kilometers to the northeast. He attempted to block the Lancastrian route to the north, it was becoming clear that Margaret was trying to move across the River Severn to reach Wales, so Edward sent a message to the governor at Margaret Pass. The Lancastrian army had no other choice but to move to the north and cross near Tewkesbury to fight him at Tewkesbury. The battlefield was full of small woods, hedges, and marshes, which was favourable for the Lancastrians, who assumed a defensive position, dividing their army into 3 equal parts. Their left and rear were protected by a river, while the centre was positioned on a hill. Similarly, Edward divided his troops into 3 groups, but a small cavalry ambush was placed in the woods to the extreme left. The Yorkists also had a decided advantage in artillery, as the army of the Queen was forced to abandon its cannons during the march. The battle started with a Yorkist advance supported by artillery volleys, but as the terrain was broken, it was impossible for Edward to move in its beginning. Somerset attempted to use the divide in the enemy forces and attacked the unit commanded by Edward. Initially, this charge surprised the king and his troops, and they were pushed back. However, the charging Lancastrians enveloped the ambushing horsemen to their rear, and a charge routed them. Most of this unit was cut down. According to the legend, Somerset managed to return to his main line and killed the commander of the centre, who failed to support him. It was clear that the Lancastrians had lost, and their retreat, Prince Edward, were executed, while Margaret was taken captive. Of the House of York decisively defeated his enemies from the House of Lancaster at Tewkesbury. Most of the Lancastrian leaders, among them Prince Edward and Edmund of Somerset, were killed, while the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, became captive. The king knew that some Lancastrian allies, chief among them Jasper Tudor, were active in Wales and northern England, so he moved his troops to Coventry to prevent his enemies from uniting their forces. Meanwhile, one of the last representatives of the Neville family, Thomas, landed in Kent and started recruiting troops on his march to London. By the 14th, Kent prisoner, but also repulsed all the attacks of Thomas Neville. Edward was fast as usual and entered London on the 21st of May. On the same night, Tudor was with his uncle Jasper in Wales at that point, France, which was ruled by Henry's relative Louis XI, but a storm forced them to land in Brittany. Its ruler, Duke Francis II, was willing to use Henry as a bargaining chip in his dealings with France and England, so the Tudors became through the years. Still, England entered a period of relative peace, as Edward had no real opponents. Louis XI traditionally supported his enemies, so when the Duke of Burgundy offered to help with the Old English claim to the French throne with his troops, Edward agreed, and in 1474 they signed a treaty in London. In June of 1475, the English king landed in Calais, but received no support from Burgundy. Neither Edward nor Louis was willing to fight, so the former bribed the latter by signing the Treaty of Picquigny. During this period, the relations between Richard of Gloucester and George against Edward, and then arrested and executed. As Richard had supported Edward throughout the Wars of the Roses, the king elevated Richard to effectively control northern England. Although Edward was just 40 years old, he became terminally ill in 1483 and soon passed away. There are multiple theories about his death, and even poisoning is not ruled out. But in any case, his 12-year-old son, Edward I, with Richard Gloucester as the regent. However, on the way to London, Richard ordered the relatives and closest allies of the Queen. Just a few months later, the offspring of Edward I were declared illegitimate, and Richard III claimed the throne. The fate of Edward V and his brother was unclear. The political situation in England once again.